When you step back and look at this case, one of the most important places to begin is with the language itself. One of the most repeated statements attributed to Ivan Miller is, "It had to be done." That phrasing is significant, not because it explains the act, but because of how it frames it. It removes choice and replaces it with necessity. Instead of language that reflects ownership, like "I decided," it shifts towards something that sounds external, almost unavoidable. Structurally, that kind of wording can distance the speaker from responsibility and position the act as a step in solving a problem, rather than a decision with moral weight. That statement is often paired with another, that he did not like to do it. When those two ideas sit next to each other, it creates a contrast. On one hand, the act is framed as necessary, and on the other, there's an attempt to soften it emotionally. Together, they acknowledge what happened, but also shape how it's presented. This kind of language can function as perception management. It doesn't tell us why in a complete sense, but it does show how the actions are being explained. When you look at the reported motive, money, and transportation to return to Iowa, it initially sounds straightforward, but the sequence of events complicates that. After the first killing, prosecutors say he took a vehicle, then later decided he didn't want that car and sought out another. That moment matters, because it shifts the situation from a single act tied to immediate need into a series of decisions. The outcome wasn't just about obtaining a car, it became about obtaining a preferred outcome. And that introduces a level of continued decision-making over time. This case doesn't unfold as one isolated event. It moves in stages, from being stranded, to entering a property, to the first killing, to taking a vehicle, to abandoning that choice, to approaching new victims, and then continuing across state lines. What stands out in that structure is the presence of time and movement between each step. These are not all happening in one compressed moment. There are transitions, changes in direction, and opportunities where different choices could have been made. That doesn't define intent on its own, but it does show a pattern of ongoing decisions rather than a single point of loss of control. Another key piece is how the victims were selected. Authorities have said there was no known connection between Miller and the three women. That places this in the category of opportunistic or situational targeting. The victims were not chosen for who they were, but because they were there, because they had something that was needed. That shift from person to circumstance is part of what makes cases like this feel especially unsettling. It removes any sense of predictability or personal link and replaces it with proximity and opportunity. There's also a notable contrast between how he was described before the events and what followed. People who interacted with him in the days prior described him as polite, normal, nothing out of the ordinary. And that contrast matters, because it highlights the gap between outward presentation and later actions. It's a reminder that behavior is often what we observe in the moment, while outcomes are something we only understand after the fact. When you bring the language and the actions together, a broader pattern starts to take shape. A problem is identified: no transportation, no money, a need to get home, and then a solution is carried out. But in that process, people become part of that solution. That's not a psychological conclusion, it's a structural observation based on the sequence of events and the stated reasoning. And then there's what's missing from the language. In the reported statements, there's little reference to the victims themselves, no acknowledgement of who they were or the impact on their lives. The focus stays on his situation, his need, his discomfort. That creates an imbalance between how the internal experience is described and how the external impact is addressed, at least in the language that's been reported. When you step back, what stands out isn't just what happened, it's how it was explained and how those explanations align with the timeline. This case isn't defined by a single moment, but by a sequence of actions, each one building on the last. And when you look at it through that lens, what remains are patterns, structure, and questions that don't resolve easily, but are still important to examine. This is Case and Cues with Carrie.